Recording in progress. Good afternoon. My name is Kate Zernicke. I'm a reporter with the New York Times, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this event, Towards Gender Equal Economies, Making Public Finance Work for Gender Equality. I want to remind everyone that we do have interpretation devices in the back. This event will be in both English and Portuguese, and you've all done this already, but please take a seat. I would like to welcome our panelists, the first panelist to come to the podium. First is Achim Steiner, the Administrator of the United Nations Development Program. The First Lady of Brazil, Janja Lula da Silva. And Chennai Mukumba, Executive Director of the Tax Justice Network, Africa. Thank you. I'm sorry, I add one more programming note. This event is being live streamed online. This high-level side event is part of this year's 68th session on the Commission on the Status of Women and has as a priority theme accelerating gender equality by addressing poverty and strengthening institutions and financing. In this context, today's event aims to discuss the interconnection between poverty eradication, fiscal policy reform, and advancing gender equality. With this distinguished panel, we will reflect on how we can make public finance, including fiscal policy and institutions, work for gender equality. We will then learn from the results of the first global dialogue on public finance and tax for gender equality and the initiative Economics. So I will take my seat and I look forward to this discussion. What's that? Oh, yeah, sorry. Oh, you're right. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. The first thing I'm going to do before we have this presentation is invite George Gray Molina, the chief economist of the UNDP, up to the podium to present the overview of current poverty and economic trends and their potential impacts on gender equality to help us frame the scene before we begin our discussion. George, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here. I wanted to start by sending greetings to Madame Rosângela da Silva, First Lady of Brazil. It's a delight to have you here with us. Ms. Chennai Mukumba, from Executive Director of the Tax Justice Network of Africa, and Mr. Achim Steiner, Administrator of UNDP. I'm very happy to join you. I will be highlighting some of the interconnections between poverty eradication, fiscal policy reform, and advancing gender equality. Let me focus first on that first set, poverty and gender, and then I'll move to gender and fiscal reform issues. In developing economies, poverty trends, as you know, have not yet converged to the level they were prior to the pandemic. And this is a remarkable statistic because most advanced industrialized economies reached that 2019 benchmark by 2021. By 2023, 691 million people were projected to be living under the $2.15 day poverty line, and 1.84 billion were living under the 365-day poverty line. Now, what is behind this lag? Income-based poverty reduction is driven mostly by gains in labor income, followed by social protection and demographic shifts in the labor market. Multidimensional poverty reduction is largely driven by access to services, electricity, water and sanitation, schooling, and access to health services. All of these drivers are amplified by gender inequality, and the direct and indirect costs are massive. Labor participation rates and pay gaps between men and women alone account for trillions of dollars in foregone labor income in developing economies, as much as 172 trillion as a gender dividend through the decade. Unpaid care work, 3/4 of which are done by women, is even larger. It accounts for close to 9% of global GDP every year, according to the ILO, or $11 trillion of unaccounted GDP, and is rightly one of the most important themes of next year's reform of the system of national accounts here at the UN Statistical Commission. Gaps in social protection between men and women are also prominent and gendered because fully 61% of the global informal sector is female. That translates into the fact that 2.4 billion of the 4 billion people not covered by social protection around the world are women. Furthermore, 1.4 billion women are unbanked and thus do not have access to payment systems or credit from the financial system. This leads to a second set of interconnections between gender and fiscal reform. Dozens of countries have enabled legal and policy frameworks designed to level the playing field, some of which we will discuss today, including targeting social transfers to women in women-led households, paid parental leave policies, and publicly funded care for children and for the elderly. The gender equality battle has thus shifted to the fiscal arena, hence the urgent need for gender-responsive budgeting, gender equality seals for public institutions, earmarked taxes for the care economy, or skills training, and more. Fiscal interventions through transfers, taxes, and subsidies are part of a larger financial architecture. Some challenges are cyclical and are related to accessing liquidity, avoiding the crowding out effects of debt servicing, or accessing development and climate financing at scale. We have flagged many of these challenges at the UN through the Secretary General's SDG stimulus proposal. But some challenges are structural, and they are part of this year's Summit of the Future discussions on international financial architecture and part of the CWS. When we unpack each country's budget, we see an X-ray of policy choices. All economies live under fiscal constraints, but there are choices to be made on active and passive labor policies, on social protection, on the care economy, and how to level the playing field and set a path for gender equality. At UNDP, we are focused at connecting some of the dots between gender equality, labor markets, social protection, and care. But we are also invested in making these fiscally and financially sustainable. Gender equality is ultimately a whole-of-society effort. It requires urgent actions to mitigate the effects of impoverishment now, but also to shift norms, structures, and power to create equal opportunities in the present. Let me stop here. I'm very interested in hearing our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, George. We'll now move on to our fireside chat. Pardon me. And the question we're asking is, what do poverty, public finance, and gender equality have to do with each other? So I'm going to start, Akim, let me start with you. Based on what we heard from George, what, in your view, needs to be fixed in the economy so that we can eliminate poverty and achieve gender equality? What's not working?
Thank you very much, Karen, and to the First Lady of Brazil and to Chena also. It's a great privilege to be here with you this afternoon. Welcome to all our guests. I think George already laid out some very interesting symptoms, so to speak, that lead us very often to having an economic perspective on our economy that is, first of all, gender blind. Secondly, that is gender discriminating, and thirdly, that is gender uninvesting. And I think this is, the example of the care economy, an unpaid but very significant part of people, but particularly women's daily work in our economy that simply is not measured. So this is one of our great problems that we still face in so many societies today, that the work that women perform and that is known to everybody is not valued in the way that we count work in our economy. So GDP growth is a totally one-eyed, so to speak, yardstick in which we are actually assessing the true value of labor and effort that is being expended in an economy. And this has been one reason why, for example, many years ago, the UNDP Human Development Report began this journey of trying to correct for not necessarily that GDP is not measuring something real, it is, but it is not everything, neither in terms of what actually happens in our economies, but also not in terms of determining whether our economies are developing in a human development sense, progressing. We are a couple of days away from releasing the 2024 Human Development Report, in which we yet again will produce the human development indices, but here I think comes the second part of why I think so much in what we do today in understanding why gender blindness, gender discrimination, gender uninvestment continue. It is rooted in a deeper condition in our societies where very often we also are experiencing a degree of polarization and public political discourse that is very much driven by the sense of insecurity and fear. So as you're trying to reform societies, you're trying to make them more inclusive, you are hitting at the same time a wave of insecurity and of fear that is being weaponized in the populist narrative of turning people against each other, including men and women. And so economic reforms, including very sensible ones in our tax code, in our fiscal policy system, that are inherently either ignorant of or positively discriminatory to women, become, in a sense, a major matter of political dispute. Not because of something that 10 years ago would have been perhaps a more agreed principle of justice and equity. No, it's now a zero-sum game politics that we are driving, and it has become weaponized through also the gender lens. And finally, the ability of governments to positively invest in measures that remove barriers that women face, and particularly also younger women that want to go into business, in our digital economy today. On the one hand, we have seen remarkable breakthroughs in, for example, financial inclusion, because this technology essentially opened the doors to a world financial system. I use that slightly melodramatic terminology because I really think it was opening the doors to a world financial system that remained closed to literally hundreds of millions of people just a few years ago. And some of that has to do with the ability to now deal with, for example, through artificial intelligence, a different way of managing the actuarial risk of lending to people who normally don't have a financial record, to microfinance, which normally is not of interest to banks because the overheads are too high and therefore you don't want to engage in it. It's not a business proposition. And to a more structural phenomenon that very often women lack: land titles, equity, elements of so-called securitization that prevented them from being even customers. So the doors literally were locked. Now, this requires governments to invest in digital public infrastructure, in addressing the pricing of affordable access to the internet, of training in the sense of school curricula, so that when girls leave a school system, they are digitally literate, so they can actually become players in the digital economy. I'll stop here, but I think these are all examples that build a little bit on the analysis that George just provided, but I think that go to the structural dimension. I'm sure, Chenna, you will also speak in a moment to our tax system, in which there are so many hidden and still embedded elements that are either disadvantageous to women or positively discriminatory. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me dig deeper, just with you, Akin, into the finance part. To ensure that our economies function, governments count on a global financial architecture and a global financial safety net to mitigate shocks and crises. And I've seen in the report of the Secretary General for the Commission on the Status of Women a call to reform the international financial architecture as a requisite to reducing poverty and hunger, as well as to achieve the SDGs and gender equality. So in your view, what would be the ideal reforms of the international financial architecture to meet our goals on gender equality and zero poverty?
Well, I'm sure my fellow panelists will answer that in a moment, perhaps with much more specificity, because I think there's a level of abstraction at which the reform of the international financial architecture, first of all, deals with a very simple and brutal fact that for the poor to access capital is to this day essentially severely constrained, whether it is by the same phenomena I just described for women walking into a banking system, or by a poor developing country on the back of a pandemic, a high national debt and high level of interest rates that they are now trying to service. And as we have repeatedly in UNDP called out over the last 1.5 years, with not a great deal of success on the G20 to respond to this, namely that many developing countries today, amongst the low income and least developed countries, have to spend more on the servicing of their loans through interest rates than they actually spend on either the education or health sector. So our international financial system, first of all, has an extraordinarily distorted way, and I represent the UN on the G20 Finance Ministers Central Bank Governors track, together with George and my colleagues in the UN. We frequently try to highlight the fact that the way that finance ministers in the G20 look at the world financial system the inherent objective of the G20 being financial stability is very one-eyed. Just to give you an illustration, in Sao Paulo just a few days ago where I was, Brazil's finance minister was trying to introduce the notion of inequality as a central concern of finance ministers and the G20 central bank governors. In an intellectual and polite sense, it was embraced, but in the actions that the G20 has been taking over the last 2 years in addressing the issue of debt distress, it basically is saying the opposite. It's saying we are heading for a soft landing. The fact that some countries are going to have a hard landing, frankly, is not material to world financial market stability. And therefore, we are not going to act on the debt issue. What we in UNDP, what we in the UN bring to this conversation is say, you look at this the wrong way. Maybe these 30, 40, 50, poorer developing countries represent maybe 2, 3, 4, 5% of global GDP. That's your way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is, this is 3 billion people. This is 40% of the world's poorest. And you're basically saying this is a price worth paying because we have, a soft landing on our horizon. And why do I mention all this? Because I think this goes to the core of an international financial system and architecture that on the one hand produces this kind of blindness again, and that the Secretary General has repeatedly highlighted, but it also commits the strategic and tragic error of actually not mobilizing positive investments. One thing is to deal with debt and all that it implies. The other half of the story is $1.8 trillion in 2023 invested into renewable energy infrastructure. We are in the midst of an energy revolution. It's a fantastic story. We have broken the back of this issue of continuing to rely on fossil fuels. No, the world is moving out of fossil fuels. And whether the text in the next COP says so or not, it's a fact of life. Now, the tragedy is that for a continent like Africa right now, of those $1.8 trillion, maybe 3%, maybe 4% actually land in terms of investments on the continent of Africa. The continent has the most people without even access to electricity. And both of these examples you can then further disaggregate by gender, because as always, when you talk about poverty, it is the majority of women who fall into the category of those who are left behind. And let me stop here, because I'm sure my esteemed panelists have much more to say on this. But there are two illustrations of a financial system that is, in its abstractness sometimes seems unreformable, but it's actually not true.
Okay, we'll hope we'll hear more about that later. Thank you, Akim. So we see that to make economies work for gender equality, we need to ensure that fiscal policies contribute to gender equality, both public spending and taxation. So I'm going to move to you, Genja, First Lady of Brazil. Thank you for joining us. And ask you to reflect on how a government decides to invest its public money can make a difference. Brazil is famous for its public programs like Bolsa Familia to help reduce economic inequalities and poverty, which is one of Brazil's priorities during your G20. Can you please explain how public spending is contributing in Brazil to advance gender equality and reduce inequalities and poverty? And what can other countries learn from Brazil's model?
Obrigada, boa tarde a todas, a todos. Olha, antes de eu começar a falar de gasto público, eu queria fazer um breve histórico da questão do Bolsa Família no Brasil, para vocês entenderem que tem muita ligação com decisão de política de governo e política de Estado. O presidente Lula se elegeu em 2013 e a prioridade dele era que as famílias mais pobres estivessem no orçamento. Você só consegue garantir com que as desigualdades realmente diminuam se você colocar os mais pobres no orçamento. E hoje, além disso, ele fala que é importante a gente taxar e tributar os mais ricos. Então, desde 2003, quando o Bolsa Família foi implementado pelo presidente Lula no governo brasileiro, a questão da desigualdade estava no foco. E falar disso é falar o quão é importante você ter uma política de governo e depois se transformar numa política de Estado. Por que eu estou falando isso? Que as políticas públicas elas não podem ser desse ou daquele governo, ou desse ou daquele presidente. Ela tem que ser política de Estado. Porque o Brasil teve uma interrupção na sua democracia, podemos falar assim. Por 6 anos, o Brasil teve um retrocesso nas suas políticas públicas, ou seja, os mais necessitados, os mais vulneráveis, as mulheres, elas deixaram de ser prioridades no governo do Brasil, que antecedeu agora o 3º mandato do presidente Lula. Em 2002, quando o presidente Lula ganha a eleição, ele diz claramente que o Brasil tinha voltado ao mapa da fome, como vocês sabem, nos últimos anos. E a gente novamente teve que fazer uma caminhada, estamos caminhando ainda para tentar retirar o Brasil do mapa da fome. Então, a democracia é fundamental. A defesa da democracia foi fundamental para que essas políticas públicas que mudam a vida das pessoas, mudam a vida das mulheres, mudam a vida das famílias ali no Bolsa Família ou em outras políticas que estão voltadas para a questão da igualdade, da desigualdade entre gênero ou a desigualdade de forma geral na sociedade, a democracia é fundamental. A gente sentiu na pele no Brasil o quanto isso foi difícil, mas graças à população brasileira, o presidente Lula voltou ao seu 3º mandato para que a gente retomasse. Muitas políticas públicas que eram políticas de governo, hoje elas são políticas de Estado. O Bolsa Família, que é o programa que vocês já conhecem, que é um programa de distribuição de renda, ele é basicamente 83% voltado para mulheres, para chefes de família, mulheres que conduzem as suas famílias, que são responsáveis pelo sustento da sua família. Isso faz uma mudança significativa na vida delas. Eu posso citar algumas outras políticas públicas que hoje são políticas de Estado. O programa Minha Casa Minha Vida, que é um programa que beneficia, em sua grande maioria, mulheres. As mulheres recebem, elas têm a segurança da moradia, para que tenha sua família com tranquilidade. E eu queria citar que, o ano passado, o governo brasileiro, a gente tem uma mulher também na condução, que é um caso raro, uma mulher na condução do Ministério do Planejamento e Orçamento. E, o ano passado, a gente fez o que chamamos de um orçamento participativo. A população foi... buscamos a população para responder quais eram as políticas públicas que elas gostariam de ver no orçamento ou conduzidas pelo governo. E eu trouxe aqui um caderno para vocês conhecerem. É uma agenda transversal do orçamento brasileiro, uma agenda que fala de todas as políticas públicas onde transversalmente estão as ações para as mulheres. Isso é fundamental, porque você identifica lá no orçamento cada política pública em que o governo brasileiro coloca dinheiro destinado para as mulheres. Não só naqueles programas que, obviamente, são para as mulheres, como saúde, atenção à saúde da mulher, ou dignidade menstrual, que é um outro programa do governo brasileiro, mas um que você nem imagina, escola em tempo integral, que é uma proposta de ampliação agora no governo brasileiro. Ela atinge diretamente a vida das mulheres. As mulheres conseguem ter mais tranquilidade sabendo que seus filhos estão na escola, estão bem alimentados, estão bem protegidos contra a violência, violência nos grandes centros que acontece. Então, as mulheres, isso atinge diretamente. Então, são políticas públicas que elas não podem ser políticas de um governo, elas têm que ser políticas de Estado. A população precisa, e principalmente a gente está falando de mulheres aqui, as mulheres precisam entender que essas políticas elas são para elas precisam se apropriar dessas políticas, para que, eu sempre falo isso lá no Brasil, para que nunca mais aconteça o que aconteceu da gente ter políticas, projetos, propostas, programas enormes que foram completamente descontinuados. E isso afetou drasticamente a vida das mulheres. E esse material que eu trouxe para vocês conhecerem, eu acho que ele é um bom exemplo que os países podem seguir para a gente conseguir mensurar exatamente a forma como atinge o PIB dos países. Que forma que você incluir as mulheres no orçamento, ter programas e políticas, você diminui desigualdade de gênero e desigualdade entre as pessoas.
Thank you, Jinja. One more thing. We're going to stick with you just for a moment, Jinja.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Does that work for you? You hearing me? One key element of public spending, or maybe we should say investment, not spending, is investing in care systems, as Achim has already indicated. What relationship have you seen between investing in strong care systems and advancing gender equality and poverty reduction?
A gente sabe que as mulheres são responsáveis, em sua grande maioria, pela questão do cuidado na sua família. Hoje a gente teve um exemplo de uma representante de um organismo da ONU que não pôde fazer a sua palestra porque ela teve que cuidar de alguém da sua família e, no lugar dela, foi um homem falar. Hoje eu quero fazer um parênteses aqui, que foi a minha primeira participação na CSW, e assim foi um pouco frustrante de ver 5 homens falando antes das mulheres, né? Então, então a gente sabe o quanto é difícil estarmos nos lugares de decisão e poder. E aquele senhor que foi substituir ela poderia ter dito: oh, não, vamos procurar uma outra mulher que esteja aqui trabalhando para que possa fazer o seu discurso. Mas não, ele fez questão de ir lá e reafirmar sua posição masculina, enfim. Mas, enfim. Então, a gente sabe que hoje foi um exemplo disso, que as mulheres estão nesse... tem essa função social do cuidado, né, de cuidar dos entes da sua família. A gente sabe da carga de jornada que as mulheres têm, dupla, tripla, às vezes quádrupla, de estar ali cuidando das questões. O presidente Lula eu tenho falado muito com ele. As pessoas me perguntam: Janja, por que você fala tanto e tal? Porque eu estou ali do lado do presidente Lula e eu quero conversar com ele sobre as coisas, né? Eu acho que eu tenho um lugar de fala, talvez, privilegiado, de estar ao lado de um homem que é um grande líder mundial, né? Mas é um homem que também tem muita escuta. Então, ele me escuta. A gente dialoga muito em casa. Nos finais de semana, a gente passa conversando, que é assim, para mim é excepcional que ele seja esse homem, tanto fora de casa, como esse líder também ser um homem dentro de casa que escuta a sua mulher. E realmente isso é muito importante para mim. E essa questão do cuidado a gente tem dialogado bastante em casa. E o Brasil está propondo agora um plano nacional sobre a questão do cuidado das mulheres. Mas talvez a mensagem que eu queria deixar aqui hoje com relação a isso é realmente a participação das mulheres, a participação feminina das mulheres, a participação política das mulheres. Porque no Brasil nós temos 16% de representação feminina no parlamento. É muito pouco. Chega a me dar uma dor no coração quando eu falo isso. É muito pouco. O Brasil é o 3º pior país do mundo em representação feminina. E eu tenho falado que a gente só vai alcançar realmente igualdade de gênero, né, igualdade para as mulheres, quando a gente tiver mais mulheres nos parlamentos, porque é ali que as leis são propostas, é ali onde as mulheres podem levar efetivamente propostas de lei, projetos de lei que atinjam diretamente a nós, nos diferentes áreas do governo federal, né, da realidade do país. A gente tem países onde tem uma representação, tem equidade nos parlamentos, mas que, mesmo assim, ainda é difícil. Imagina em países onde a gente não tem essa representação. Então, eu tenho falado bastante sobre a participação política das mulheres. A gente vê que a violência política de gênero aumenta a cada vez mais no Brasil. Eu sou uma mulher que sofre muito com violência política nas redes sociais. E isso isso está levando as mulheres a desistirem da política, da representação delas nos parlamentos. E isso é um problema para nós e acho que deve ser um problema. E não é um problema localizado do Brasil, é um problema mundial, a questão da violência política de gênero. E talvez a gente precise, de uma forma mais incisiva, falar mais sobre isso e buscar soluções para essa questão. Né? Então, eu acho que a representação política talvez seja a principal ferramenta que nós, mulheres, temos para garantir que políticas que atinjam a nossa vida efetivamente aconteçam.
Thank you very much, Jinja. In fact, public spending is a significant part of fiscal policy, and another critical area are tax policies, particularly in the current context of high public debt distress and the need to expand fiscal spaces. Let me move next to Shania Makumba, who's Executive Director of the Tax Justice Network Africa. Shania, you work to help advance accountable and progressive tax systems in Africa, and part of your work includes advancing gender equality. Can you please elaborate on how fiscal policies, tax systems can, in fact, help advance gender equality?
Thank you for that question. First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be able to sit on this panel and speak to this issue. As TJNA, as you've rightly indicated, we do a lot of work to advocate for progressive taxation systems. And a lot of that includes the way in which taxation systems can foster and promote gender equality. The importance of this panel today is because often you tend to find that those conversations happen in silos, where you have conversations where you have gender activists in one room and conversations where you have tax conversationalists in another. And increasingly what needs to happen, and which is why I'm very excited to be sitting in this panel, is we need to see the intersection of tax experts and feminists as well. And so, in fact, one of the things we're doing at TJNA is we are launching and putting together a Pan-Africanist tax feminist initiative to help do some of that work. And so what I'm going to be sharing really kind of draws from that work. But really the big point behind this is that tax policy can play an incredibly important role in promoting and fostering gender equality. And I'm going to speak to a couple of ways in which that can happen. First of all, as an institution, we advocate for progressive taxation policies. And really, in short, what this means is that those who earn the most should pay the most, right? Where we need to see high-income individuals, as well as corporations, contributing proportionally more to public revenues. And this is important when you realize that often it is women that find themselves at the lower end of wage earnings. And so what we need to see is that those with higher capacity are the ones that are contributing more towards public revenues. And there's a number of ways this can happen, right? There is a number of national level policies that governments can put in place to do this, but also we need to see reforms even at the international level that can help address the issue of high net worth individuals, corporations taking advantage of loopholes that exist within that system to avoid paying their fair share. And to one of the points that Akim mentioned, there's currently a conversation happening right now on the reform of the global tax system to help us address some of these issues, to help us address some of the loopholes that exist where we tend to see those higher net worth individuals, corporations able to take advantage of these gaps that exist in the global tax system and as such not pay their fair share in order to then have the revenues that we need to fund very key and important public sectors that were mentioned just now by the First Lady. The second thing that tax policy can do to promote gender equality is putting in place family-friendly tax policies, right? And this looks like producing or introducing tax incentives for businesses that provide family-friendly policies such as parental leave, flexible working hours, childcare support, or offering tax credits or deductions for childcare expenses, making it much more affordable for families, as well as encouraging gender-neutral caregiving responsibilities. So there's a lot that can be done by a government to put in place a mechanism that can support policies that are actually in promotion of gender equality. But when we have this conversation, it's also very, very important that we are context specific about the solutions that we're putting forward. So I work for TJNA, and when you consider the African context, you tend to find that most of our population finds itself employed within the agriculture sector. And you tend to find that almost 60% of participants in the agriculture sector are women, right? And so there's a lot that can be said about the way in which tax policy focused on the agriculture sector can also play a role in promoting gender equality. And so what can that look like? Again, access to credit for women that are involved in that sector. It can also look like tax incentives for women-led agricultural enterprises, right? And so this speaking to the fact that when we are taking a look at the way in which tax policy can contribute to gender equality, you need to look at the intersection between gender and the economies that are relevant to that context. Another really important element, for example, when thinking about African economies, is that we have a really large informal sector. And again, we have a significant number of women that participate within the informal sector. And so we need fiscal policies that recognize this, and fiscal policies that are able to support women that are participating in the informal sector. And this looks like tax structures that are not overly burdensome, and also ensuring that women that are participating in that sector have the access that they need to do the work that they're doing. And then the last point that I think I would speak to here, this tends to be the one that is most known, but we need to look at the way in which our governments are putting in place value-add tax. To what extent can we minimize value-add tax for goods and services that disproportionately impact women? And so this looks like childcare items, this looks like sanitary products, etc. And so there needs to be an assessment of the different goods and services that women employ within an economy to ensure that we're not trying to raise revenue in ways that can be deemed to be regressive. And so a combination of fiscal and tax policy tools can be implemented in a way that promotes gender equality when we're having this conversation.
Thank you, Shania. I do want to move to audience questions in a moment, but just to ask a little bit more from you, how do you see this change happening, and what role do you see for governments and civil society activists attending here today? What suggestion would you give those people, those attending, who are willing to initiate reforms for gender equality?
Thank you. I take note of the time question, so I'll be very quick. So I think on the part of the roles of governments, I think the first thing that I would say is incredibly important is we need to start collecting, first of all, gender disaggregated data. Thank you very much. I think at the end of the day, we need to be making informed, evidence-based decisions, and we can only do that when we have the correct numbers. And so I would say that's the first thing we need on the part of governments. And then the second thing is we need legislation. So we need governments to enact legislation that explicitly promotes gender equality in taxation. And so this can involve, for example, the creation of laws that prohibit discrimination in tax codes, as well as encouraging inclusive policies. And then very quickly, on the part of civil society can, number one, play the monitoring and accountability role, where we are the ones that are taking a look at what's being put forth by government, and then speaking truth to power, right, when actions are not matching with words. And then the second thing I would say as a role for civil society is the work of raising awareness, right? Because what is not discussed, what is not known, can then not be advocated for on both the part of civil society but themselves, but then also women that are being affected in this way. So I would say those two for governments and those two for civil society.
Thank you very much. So we are seeing that ending poverty and advancing gender equality requires a major shift in economic thinking and a fundamental reconfiguration of economic power relations. We need well-designed economic structures, policies, and institutions that place gender equality and human and environmental well-being at the center of economies. So I do invite your questions. I don't know, do we have a microphone going around? We can repeat the question if it's unable to hear you. But yes, right here.
Hola, muy buenas tardes. Gracias por permitirnos estar acá. Gracias a la invitación de PNUD, de Guillermina Martí. He intentado escuchar para entender el mensaje de cada uno de ustedes. Yo hablo español, conseguí una traducción en portugués. Muchas gracias por eso. Cuando se habla de cómo acortar las desigualdades, las brechas, la pobreza, y acabamos de escuchar que también hay que desagregar los datos para mujeres. Pero hablando de mujeres, hay que desagregar más para las mujeres que habitamos, que vivimos, nacemos, producimos y reproducimos en el campo, en la tierra. Para las que producimos los alimentos, para las familias de las ciudades y para el mundo. En pandemia tienen que reconocer que si alguien dio de comer al mundo son las manos de mujeres rurales. Indistintamente de si somos indígenas, el color de nuestra piel, credo político o religioso, somos las que estamos ahí en la chacra, trabajando sin salario ni horario, sin ninguna ventaja, absolutamente ninguna ventaja. He escuchado del señor presidente Lula en agosto que está trabajando por las mujeres que están en la foresta. Y si hablamos de cuidados, nosotras, las rurales, las campesinas, somos las guardianas y cuidadoras de la vida, de la naturaleza, de los recursos naturales, del agua, de las semillas, del aire y de los productos sanos para la gente. Entonces, ¿cómo hacer eso para que también, bueno, y también hicimos un estudio en pandemia con el PNUD, las voces de las mujeres, si ustedes encuentran está ahí ese estudio, con 16 países de Latinoamérica y el Caribe. Y ahí podemos ver todo, no todo, pero una buena parte de lo que nosotras las campesinas, la gente de a pie, aportamos. Pero ¿cómo quisiéramos que las políticas públicas sean más justas? Que los créditos, existan créditos blandos, a largo plazo y a bajo interés. No podemos nosotras competir con los millonarios que sacan créditos y pagan al 15-16% de interés. Deberían haber intereses al 1, al 2, al 3% y a largo plazo, por favor, para acabar con la pobreza. Muchas gracias. Espero haber dicho algo oportuno. Gracias.
I am going to translate into English for other colleagues to listen to it. So what she was, she introduced herself, Guillermina Martin, and she says that she represents women working in agriculture, women living in rural areas. She said that regardless whether they're indigenous, white, black, all of them, they work long hours they are working long hours in the field, no pay, and she was reflecting then who is taking care of us, or who is representing us, or how can we really then get public policies that work for us. So she was presenting, for example, how can we compete with these large companies if we can have credit? So are we going to have soft credits with long-term repayments? Yes, I think that was It's exactly soft credits with low interest rate. So she was just reflecting on that and mentioning that UNDP launched a study in 16 countries in Latin America where they were reflecting on the voices from women working in rural areas. She was saying it's important that they consider us also because we are the ones who are taking care of the land, but also taking care of nature, protecting climate.
I think Genja will take that question. Here. Yeah, here.
Obrigada por suas palavras. Tinha tanta, eu sei que o tempo é curto, eu tinha outras coisas para falar na minha fala e talvez o que ficou faltando é justamente isso, né? No Brasil a gente sabe que a agricultura familiar ela é essencialmente conduzida pelas mulheres. As mulheres é que colocam a comida que a gente come na cidade. As mulheres do campo produzem os alimentos que nos dão vida. E a gente tem isso muito claro no Brasil, tanto que no Brasil a gente tem um programa que chama Pronaf Mulher, ou seja, o financiamento da agricultura familiar para as mulheres, diferenciado com taxas, com um crédito mais extenso. E isso eu estou falando porque eu tenho ouvido muito o presidente Lula nos fóruns internacionais falar da nova arquitetura financeira mundial, que a gente precisa buscar primeiro uma nova governança mundial e depois uma nova arquitetura financeira global. Não é possível os países da África, né, estarem arcando com uma dívida que nunca vai conseguir pagar, porque não tem condição de pagar, enquanto os seus países vivem à míngua, a sua população vive muito mal, Então, o presidente Lula tem falado isso. No G20, que o Brasil é presidente do G20 esse ano, o presidente Lula tem conduzido o G20, todas as trilhas, principalmente a financeira, para que a questão de gênero apareça transversalmente nas trilhas. Você está acompanhando, né? Ele foi uma orientação dele para que a questão de gênero das mulheres apareçam em todos os grupos de trabalho do G20. E esse vai ser o primeiro G20 esse ano em que a gente tem um grupo específico de empoderamento das mulheres. E eu estou muito feliz que isso aconteça no Brasil. E depois, o ano que vem, a gente vai ter a COP, em que não vai dar tempo, né, também da gente discorrer um pouco sobre a questão da importância dos povos da floresta, que são também, em sua grande maioria, mulheres que cuidam, né, dessa herança, dessa ancestralidade. Isso é muito importante. Então, só para concluir, o presidente Lula lançou, agora no começo do ano, quando assumiu a presidência do G20, a Aliança Global contra a Pobreza e a Fome. E esse vai ser, né, o tema que vai conduzir todos os grupos de trabalho, e a proposta dele é que realmente os países ricos, né, possam olhar de uma forma diferente para o mundo, para os países que estão em desenvolvimento, para os países do sul global, para os países da África, para que a gente possa efetivamente contribuir com a redução da desigualdade no mundo. E a gente já vai conseguir isso realmente quando as pessoas, né, quando os países entenderem que dividir riqueza é fortalecer a todos enquanto humanidade. É isso.
Thank you for that. Is there another question right here? Yes, thank you.
Yes, just wanted to make a clarification. Her name is Luz.
Thank you. My name is Melvin Wajiri, distinguished panelist, all due respect. I'm from Cameroon. I want to be very precise, from Africa. I'm glad that you made mention of a lot of allusions in Africa. I can understand where you're coming from. I think the administrator also understands, because UNDP is really present in Cameroon and in Africa. I have a worry, which you're the better place to explain that to me, looking at vis-a-vis the document that we have, which is the 2022-2025 strategy. I'm thinking aloud, how do you plan to ensure that countries adapt this and to make sure we have proper indicators to monitor the progress made in public financing and gender equality, looking at the scenarios. We are opportune to sit here. I don't know how many women from Africa have the finances to pay, to pay and attend this. And those are the aspects we need to address if we sit here to talk about global issues that concerns people in all aspects, everywhere around the world. I don't know how you intend to address. Thank you. I don't know how you intend to talk, because I know you speak with them, of course, the people, the government. In Africa, in Cameroon, the UNDP, you may know, work more with the government in terms of programming. The civil society, sometimes when we go through, I've been opportune to receive funding from the UNDP. I must draw that to your attention, and thank you. Maybe I will be coming again. Now, looking at the budget, in the budget allocation, and NGOs that are the foot soldiers that are making the decisions. We all here who are seated here, we are the foot soldiers to make those decisions, to get those indicators, to help to match. Look at the portion that is allocated to support the NGOs. Do you think it's very fair to make sure that we attend gender equality within the strategy that you have put in place? It's a wonderful document, I love it. But I want you to tell us, how can we also engage in supporting your mission to make sure that you realize this? It will be very important for us. And my sister, I understand the tax system in Africa, in Cameroon more precisely. Looking at the work that you do, how do you intend to share best practices in other countries so that they can emulate this and do the budget tracking like we did with the one in HIV, when HIV started in Africa? And Your Excellency, it will be very more interesting and very appealing if we have many other women, others, head of state women seated here and having this debate, not only you alone or the next year we are coming. It will be interested for you to carry this message, because I know now you seated, you're an ambassador. You can carry this to Africa, to have the women head of states to sit with you and discuss about gender equality. You play a key. We should not bury our head in the sand and refuse that. You talk with your husband in the night so you can influence this policy. Thank you.
Akeem, do you want to start with that?
Yes, or for breakfast, I'm sure as well, because I know many conversations happen around the kitchen table about where things should be different. And I will just answer very briefly. I assume you're referring to our the UNDP gender strategy, right, on gender equality, yeah. Well, first of all, I think by having such a strategy, we commit ourselves. Commitments, however, you quite rightly can say, are cheap if they're inconsequential. But we do actually have quite a number of indicators within our strategy that makes us, first of all, accountable to ourselves. And in fact, Raquel sits here. We just met last week again in our gender strategy leadership team. It is the entire executive group of UNDP that meets at least 3 times a year to review both gender parity and gender equity in our work. We have set ourselves also objectives right now, for instance, in helping to mobilize financing that is specifically targeted at addressing gender inequality. And this is obviously something that is sometimes difficult because we don't control necessarily how financial flows happen, but you may or may not be familiar that we set ourselves something that many laughed about. We set ourselves a target of trying to influence $1 trillion in the 4 years of our strategic framework that would be deployed specifically towards investing in SDGs. And within that, we have an amount now, I just have to check, Raquel, 350 or 380 million we spoke about mobilizing as part of the 100 billion. So I've been in different meetings. $1 trillion mobilized over 4 years in terms of investing more in additional financing in the SDGs, $100 billion within that, specifically on mobilizing towards investment in women, girls, gender-specific issues. So how do we actually, our total volume of financing in a year is around $4.5 to $5 billion, which is a lot of money. But in the larger scheme of things, you already see that it's another homeopathic kind of investment in it. the way we try to do it is to influence how both financial sector, but also how governments and public budgets invest in these issues. So at the moment, UNDP is supporting with the UN system so-called integrated national financing frameworks in over 80 countries around the world. They are a way in which government is looking at public, private, concessional, non-concessional borrowing, international, domestic finance, and setting priorities and resetting priorities, including redirecting public budgets or creating the kind of tax incentives and policies that would attract more private investment, specifically whether it is SDG 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 17. And that, I think, creates a degree of accountability on how we are trying to expand the financing of investments in women, in girls, and to address the gender inequality issue. I don't want to take more time because, again, we could tell you many examples, but it's just one way in which we do that. As for NGOs, we work with many of them, but we are not principally a financing agency. This is always the challenge. We, very often we do work with governments as the principal counterpart because we are a UN, United Nations development program that is there at the invitation of your governments. And I really mean it. UNDP is not there for any other reason than a country saying, we want UNDP to be part of our development ecosystem in our country. So yes, we go through government. It's a, sometimes more, sometimes less legitimate. We all know the schizophrenia, so to speak, of sometimes being in an intergovernmental system. But at the end of the day, it is our commitment to a country. Through that, we then work very often with civil society. But we are not principally like a bilateral agency making grants. We may sometimes bring financing from the Green Environment Facility, the Green Climate Fund. And therein, there are many, many engagements with civil society, including not least through the Small Grants Program, which is not massive in financial volume, but actually has a track record of working with some of the most overlooked civil society organizations in countries such as Cameroon as well. Let me stop here. I mean, I don't want to make it look bigger than it is, but in our DNA, it is integral to understanding our role in a country. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Did you want to add just something briefly, Shania?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
So maybe just in response to your specific question, as TGNA, we operate as a network. So we have local level civil society organizations that are members of TGNA that we work with to produce research, do awareness raising, engaging capacity building, and sometimes even engaging in public interest litigation in order to, like I mentioned earlier, promote progressive taxation as well as work towards curbing illicit financial flows. And so in Cameroon, we actually have a partner. Their name is CRADEC, and we work very closely with them. And maybe just to flag some of the work that they've been doing, they've launched a national parliamentary caucus, essentially where they're working with members of parliament to do this very work, to get them to raise questions in parliament as well as to ask questions whenever there's a tax policy that's looking regressive in order to essentially see the extent to which we can have fiscal policies that can help us promote gender equality. So happy to talk more, but maybe just to answer quickly.
Thank you very much, I appreciate that. We have time for one more. I think there is a question up front here, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very interesting panel. I'm Ann Linde. I'm the former foreign minister of Sweden, which had a feminist foreign policy. I think that what this panel shows is really that it's not the individual for each woman to have a career, but it's broad reforms, structural reforms that is needed. And just in 1 second, the 3 most important reforms for us to be the most equal country in the world was to change the taxation system from being individual to, from being family to being individual taxation. That meant that all the women could go out and work. Second, to have affordable childcare and elderly care. Now there is a roof of $100 per child per month. And third, to have parental leave for both. I cannot talk more? For more. For more.
And very still, maybe.
parental leave for both men and women, and it should be divided between the men and the women. I have two questions. One is for the First Lady of Brazil. I think that what's happening in some of the countries, Brazil before and Argentina now, is very worrying. It's kind of a right-wing, masculine, toxic situation that is getting backlash for women. And you say that now you're trying to reverse it. But why is this happening now in country and after country, and how can you do to reverse it? And the second is to Chennai. I was last week in Nigeria on a conference before the SOFA called The Africa We Want, the UN We Need. And there was a lot of talk about G7 and G20, and I was very interesting to hear your words about silos and people are not working together. So I wonder, do you see any chances of breaking up the silos? And another worrying thing was that I heard also from the representatives in this conference that people said Africa is so far away, it's no use. Look at the difference between Nigeria and Singapore. Why do we need democracy? It doesn't leverage. We need to have some more strong leaders who just say where we are going. That will be much better for the people of Africa. And that scared me also a little bit. So if you could comment on that, I would be happy. Thank you.
Yeah, so just quickly, Genja, do you want to take the first part and then Chennai? Yeah, thank you.
Obrigada pela sua pergunta. Como eu disse, essa questão da defesa da democracia é importante. E quando a gente fala em defesa da democracia, é que a gente vê em alguns lugares do mundo, como aconteceu no Brasil e agora na Argentina, um avanço de uma, vamos ser clara, de uma direita fascista, onde as mulheres não têm lugar nesse mundo. E isso é claro. Quando você destrói as mulheres, você destrói talvez uma parte da humanidade que nos move, né? E que faz com que as sociedades tenham um pouco mais de solidariedade, né? De mais proximidade, de mais aconchego com as coisas. É muito difícil falar por que acontece. No Brasil, me parece que isso era meio latente, mas a gente teve tantos avanços na questão das políticas públicas e tal, que isso foi minguando, foi minguando. Mas teve um momento do Brasil também que houve uma ruptura disso e parece que essa parte da população saiu de algum lugar e começou a vociferar horrores contra as mulheres, contra os indígenas, contra os negros, enfim. É uma maioria, obviamente, masculina e branca que faz isso, mas a gente também, infelizmente, vê muitas mulheres participando disso, né? Eu sempre digo que a gente tem, através do discurso político, tentar transformar mentes e corações. A gente não pode desistir nunca. Na Argentina vive isso, em Portugal, ontem, esse final de semana, na eleição. Então, esse é um avanço, e não é uma questão de direita ou esquerda, é uma questão de humanidade, às vezes, né? Porque quando você vê um presidente da República descontinuar programa que atende pessoas que estão com câncer, como foi agora no caso da Argentina, você afeta diretamente a vida das mulheres que, né, têm câncer de mama, têm câncer de útero, você atinge diretamente a vida delas. Então, é um fenômeno global, infelizmente, que a gente tem que diariamente reafirmar as nossas posições e pelo que sociedade a gente quer. E não é uma sociedade para o futuro, que sociedade que a gente quer viver. É uma sociedade de ódio, e aí eu responsabilizo muito as grandes big techs. No Brasil, elas são responsáveis por isso, e eu falo daqui, né, da casa das grandes big techs, que são os donos que estão aqui, no país delas. Eu fui, no final do ano, meu Twitter X, né, foi invadido e foram mensagens horríveis. Eu passei algumas horas desesperadora. Eu entendo que as pessoas fazem isso, mas às vezes chega num nível que atinge o seu emocional mesmo, né? Eu tento me fortalecer para isso, mas aquele dia foi muito ruim. Enfim, e como é que a gente faz isso? A gente precisa regulamentar redes. Como eu falei, a gente precisa de mais mulheres nos espaços, nos parlamentos, e em mais lugares nos espaços de decisão. Hoje, o que a gente viu aqui na CSW não pode realmente acontecer. Vocês me desculpem, 5 homens falar, o presidente da CSW ser um homem, eu falei assim, não, estou no lugar errado, não é possível. Então, é nós que temos que falar, né? Nós que temos que voltar para os nossos países e todo dia reafirmar isso. Eu reafirmo isso todo dia. Às vezes as pessoas falam, mas o preso é muito cruel. Infelizmente, é. E, às vezes, a gente precisa negociar. É a arte da guerra, né? Você dá um retrocesso para poder avançar um pouco. Mas só que a gente não pode avançar tudo a ponto de eliminar tudo, né? A gente precisa estar sempre vigilante. É isso.
In the United States, we have a word called manels to when we see nothing but men up on the dais. Chennai, do you want to just make a quick comment?
Yes, I'll be very brief. First of all, I think lessons can be learned. I think, like you've just indicated, with regards to the way in which you've made progress, and I think it's really good to hear some of the policies you're implementing. Secondly, I completely agree. We need to have less siloed spaces where fiscal policy experts and gender experts are coming together, because any solution that's coming from either one of the two will result in suboptimal results. And then to your third point, this narrative that you've just alluded to, right, about African countries, global South countries, is one that, quite frankly, is exhausting. And I think, maybe to begin with what you say, there are certain solutions that need to be taken at the national level, right, to help us address a number of issues that we are confronted with that are holding back our development. But what is also equally, if not more important, is the current global system within which we operate. And I think the question around the global financial architecture reform is incredibly important for a number of reasons. First of all, we live in a society that currently is exacerbating and perpetuating the subjugation of global South countries, and this is why we need reform. So, for example, there was mention about the debt crisis. There's no world in which we can be living in an economy that allows for countries to be paying more in debt services than it is investing in education and health and social sectors, right? We also can't have, from a tax side, a global tax system that sees the loss of almost $100 billion annually in illicit financial flows, and 2/3 of that being as a result of the activity of global north multinational corporations that are in the global south that are funneling these resources. And so whilst there definitely needs to be work at national level, and we don't deny that, there needs to be equally, if not more, reform of the global system that is seeing the perpetuation of the current space where you see global South countries. So just to flag that this is often a narrative that is told in different spaces, but it's incomplete, it's inaccurate, and we need to start having much more systemic, structural conversations that are important to help us see the global South countries, African countries actually achieve their developmental objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Shania. And thank you to our panelists, Chenja, Akim, and Shania. I'll ask you to take your seats now, and we will welcome up to the podium Raquel Lagunas, who is the Director of Gender Equality, UNDP, and Tom Below, who is Director of the Sustainable Finance Hub, OIC, UNDP, to come to the stage. They're going to present the flagship Economics, Making Fiscal Policies Work for Gender Equality, and explain more about the first UNDP Global Dialogue on Public Finance and Tax for Gender Equality. So Raquel and Tom.
Hello. So, I wanted really to thank the panel because it was not only inspirational, also provocative, but I wanted to thank even more people who were asking questions that trigger our comfort zones. So this is, for UNDP, this is always welcome. So I thank you all. I thank you all. The next 10 minutes is about how do we implement, how do we change reality, right? I was very touched by the sentence from the First Lady of Brazil that she said, when we share the wealth, the entire humankind become better. The UNDP has a big commitment on how we can share the wealth. So the program that we wanted to introduce quickly is the one named or called Economics. I hope it's in the screen, even though I don't see the screen. So. And let's go to the next slide. This is Economics, what you have in front of you, with 3 priority areas that have been mentioned by our colleague from Sweden. The first one is fiscal policies that work for everybody and works for gender equality. The second one is the expansion of care systems, care services, including the costing and the financing, right, of these services. And the third one is research and data to influence policy. But we cannot do that without investing in capacities, in expertise, and this is what you see also in the screen. That is the global lab on feminist economies that is at the same time doing this work internally with UNDP, but also with partners, connecting all the knowledge from the feminist economists with our economists. So this is a global learning lab that partners are also invited and are building this knowledge. So if we go to the next slide, you will see what is economics about. So today we are going to talk about only the fiscal policy track. We are looking for together revenue and also public expenditures. We think as UNDP that to connect these silos, we need to see the entire fiscal policy landscape. So we are trying to look together income, revenue, expenditures, budget, plus institutional reforms. So we think that without institutions that can operate efficiently, transparently, and being also accountable for what they do, it's impossible to do any tax reform, to implement any fiscal policy. So we have these 3 elements very kind of vertebrated and together. And we also offer, and we are supporting countries in a series of services that I hope maybe Tom can elaborate more. And as we said, Tom is the head acting ad interim of our financing hub, Financing for SDG Hub. So this is a genuine collaboration between 2 big silos. Before, not anymore. So we integrated our work, and I would like to have Tom introducing quickly the support that we provide in countries. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks so much, Raquel. And just in brief, just 2 dimensions of our support to countries I wanted to highlight. The first, Raquel, you've already introduced, which is really looking at public finance in a new way, reimagining public finance. There are a number of ways you could term it, actually. Rebalancing the books is a way I like to frame it, which means not just looking at tax and expenditure from the perspective of above the line and below the line. In other words, looking at tax and expenditures to make it add up in mathematical terms. But looking at tax and expenditure in terms of the return on gender equality or on development outcomes. And I think, Chennai, you made a number of brilliant points, you always do, in relation to how to look at tax from a gender perspective. But I think one of the struggles we have, or an additional struggle we have, and ministries of finance are grappling with, is how to look at tax and its interrelationship with expenditures vis-a-vis gender equality, to look at both progressive taxation and progressive expenditure. And one of the services that we're providing governments is really to look at their medium-term expenditure frameworks, their medium-term revenue strategies, and how to integrate gender within those as key performance indicators. The second service I just wanted to highlight is the work that our administrator Akim was referencing, which is supporting ministries of finance to look at integrated national financing frameworks, not just from a public perspective, but also from a private perspective. How to put in place financing strategies for gender equality that incorporate public finance, but also look at capital markets, look at blended finance, look at the ways in which to influence private investment towards gender equality. So we're working in 86 different countries around the world, looking at those dimensions of integrated national financing frameworks as well. I don't know which slide we're on there, Raquel. It's very difficult to see. Is it next to the dialogue, or did you want to come back? Yeah.
There is another one. Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much. You talk always very eloquently about the work on fiscal policies. Definitely, those are services that we are providing, including also help countries to build the political will, right? Without the political decisions at the top of the government, is so difficult. We only will work fragmented, in fragments, no? When we talk about taxes. And definitely data generation and different kind of assessments, including impact assessments. So if we go to the next slide, you see the countries where we are already present, a total of 27. Some of them are at the beginning, I think like 12. Others are not beginners, but they are in the middle of the implementation of different reforms, and 12 more are waiting for some support. We wanted to talk to you, and we close here, about something that, about a global dialogue that that it happened in February in Istanbul, where we put and sit together, and it's what the colleague from Cameroon said, ministries of finance, together with tax institutions, together with the gender constituency and the gender experts and the economists from the gender field. And this was an amazing experience that also, Tom, you may want to elaborate. 180 participants, 40 country delegations, and we were pretty surprised with the response. So what does it mean? It means there is an appetite, there is a niche, there is a need there. So there is a counter movement that we can activate and support. And in this sense, we wanted to share some of the conclusions and what we learned in this global event that is coming directly from them, from the countries, from the owners. And the first is that countries are really far away from having fiscal objectives or goals aligned to SDGs and aligned to gender equality. That's the reality that we found. It's not a surprise, but it's different when the owners and the institutions are the ones that are talking about it. Second, definitely there is insufficient analysis on the impact of fiscal policies in the poorest, on the impact also of the differentiated impact on women and men, or gender impact in general. The third one is the political will of institutions, at least attending this global conversation, was very strong. They all wanted to do something, but at the same time is proportionate to the needs of capacity building. The international community also, and as Tom said, should look together revenue and public expenditures. That's the only way of having comprehensive reforms. And another conclusion or highlight coming from this global event is the need to build a bridge between institutions. Usually we target one institution, we work on parity a little bit, we provide some trainings, but we do not go through a comprehensive reform of the ecosystem of financial institutions. And this was very clear also coming in this conversation. Of course, sex disaggregated data, gender statistics are very much needed, like on household composition, consumption patterns, gender taxpayers, so the list is long. It's long, but it's very concrete and specific, and those are the good news. Maybe the last one is about how can we capitalize on the artificial intelligence, right? And new technologies to have public institutions fit for purpose. So those are some highlights from the global dialogue. I don't know, Tom, if you wanted to complement? Or
Just one.
Absolutely.
Just one, Raquel, because having been in that dialogue, I just wanted to highlight how important it was to create a safe space for a discussion around gender equality, tax and expenditure. We all know these different fields, I think, and they're very precious. Tax is a sovereign instrument. It's a relationship between state and citizen. Gender equality is about the well-being of society. And public expenditure is using the resources of a country's own coffers as efficiently and effectively as possible. These are very sensitive, important subjects. Actually, the colleagues across those three silos don't talk to each other very often, even expenditure and tax colleagues. And it was very important to go through a process of discomfort with this dialogue, because it's only through bringing unlikely actors together like this that we can find the solutions to progress, frankly, very slow public financial management reform, very slow domestic resource mobilization, and very slow progress on gender equality. So really important to bring together those different stakeholders in new ways. Thanks, Raquel.
Thank you so much, Tom. And just to, yes, you can clap. You can clap, Tom. We do it. And just to close, I would like to share the next steps. I would like to share, first of all, that UNDP really is committed to the fiscal policies for gender equality agenda. This is what we are going to do in the next years, and this is what economics, together with our colleagues from the SDG Financing Hub, are going to invest. Next steps is we will articulate this incredible demand of support that we now have, coming from these 40 countries. We wanted to listen very well the demands. We will use different entry points, cannot use one recipe, go and apply. It doesn't make any sense. So we will apply the context filter, and we will not do it to IFIs, women's organizations, institutions. So we wanted to keep these different angles, voices together, moving this agenda. And we need to definitely put together the methodologies. Some of them are already there. We don't need to invent the wheel, but we will put together the knowledge. We will strengthen the methodologies to support these countries that are definitely front runners, and we will consolidate the expertise. This agenda, colleagues, is also not national, it's global, and it was very interesting, the panel. I don't need really to explain why this agenda is global. So UNDP will love and would like to move with this agenda to bigger and broader forums, like the Global Forum, like the Financing for Development Forum, Summit for the Future, G20, that I think we don't need really to push a lot, because it's led by Brazil, and definitely, just to finish, mobilizing resources. So thank you so much for listening. This is our plan, and it was very special and important for us to share this with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raquel and Tom. And if everyone could just remember to, first of all, thank you all for coming and for this very important conversation. These are enormous problems, but also enormously important problems to tackle. If everyone could remember to return their translation devices to the back of the room, that would help us all very much. Thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon.